Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Office Hours Politics Edition. I'm your host, Ziana, and today we're diving into the deep world of political ideas, the famous and sometimes confusing and sometimes overused isms. You definitely heard people throw around words like liberalism, socialism, nationalism, feminism, but what do they actually mean? Where did they come from? And why do they still matter today? That's what we're going to talk about in this episode. And I want you to leave here not just recognizing these terms, but being able to explain them, connect them to history, and see how they play out in our everyday lives. And since this is office hours, think of me as your professor. Let's get into our first ism, liberalism. Liberalism is one of the most common political labels out there, but it is also the most misunderstood. Some people hear liberal and they think of progressive politicians in the US. Others think of free markets and capitalism. And in some parts of the world, being called a liberal is basically an insult. So, where did it start? We have to go back to the 17th and 18th century in Europe. Think about philosophers like John Locke, Adam Smith, and later John Stuart Mills. These thinkers were reacting against absolute monarchies and religious domination. Their main idea was the individual matters. People should have natural rights like life, liberty, and property, and that no king or government can just take that away. Locke especially was hung on the idea of property. He believed that when you mix your labor with the land, you gain ownership. That sounds fair in theory, however, it was later used as a justification for colonialism. Europeans claiming indigenous land because they worked it. So even from the beginning, liberalism had contradictions baked into it. What are the core beliefs of liberalism? Individual freedom, limited government, rule of law, private property, and eventually democracy. Though not right away, because the early liberals were the most wealthy male men who didn't think everyone deserved a vote. Fast forward to the 19th and 20th centuries, liberalism evolved. You get branches such as classic liberalism and modern liberalism. Classic liberalism is basically laissez faire, let the market do its thing, let people trade freely, and the government should stay out of the way. Think Adam Smith and the invisible hand. Modern liberalism, though, realizes that total free markets can create massive inequalities. So governments step in with welfare programs, regulations, social safety nets. And this is where we get things like unemployment insurance, universal health care, and public education. So when you hear the word liberal today, it might mean something very different depending on where you are. In the US, liberals are associated with the left, with Democrats, with social programs, with progressiveness. In Canada, liberalism is tied to the Liberal Party, which has historically been centrist, supporting markets but also welfare policies. And globally, liberalism still carries that original emphasis on individual freedom and democracy. But here's the catch. Liberalism has always been critiqued. Some argue that it's too focused on individuals and ignore communities or respective or collective responsibility. Others say it's a mask for capitalism and colonialism, spreading Western values while dismissing others. Think about how the US invaded countries under the banter of spreading liberal democracy, or Canada defending human rights abroad while violating Indigenous rights at home. That's liberalism in practice, noble ideas, but often compromised by power and inequality. So why does liberalism still matter today? Because it's a dominant framework for most Western democracies. When we talk about free speech, human rights, or the value of law, that's liberalism at work. But the debates we're having now about inequality, systemic racism, and climate change are also debates about the limits of liberalism. That was your crash course. Moving on to socialism. What is socialism? At its core, it's the belief that society should be organized around equality, community, and collective ownership. That's the opposite of liberalism. and its obsession with individual property and markets. Historically, socialism emerged in the 19th century right after the Industrial Revolution. Factories were booming, but workers were living in poverty. You had kids working 14-hour shifts under unsafe conditions, and you had a handful of rich industrials getting insanely wealthy while everyone suffered. This is where Karl Marx steps in with the Communist Manifesto in 1848. They looked at capitalism and said, this is a system built on exploitation. Workers produce wealth, but owners take the profit. For Marx, the solution was revolution, workers rising up, overthrowing capitalism, and creating a classless society. Now, socialism isn't one thing. There are many different versions. Marxist socialism is very radical, revolutionary, and its end goal is communism, where social democracy is more reformist, trying to make capitalism more humane through welfare states and redistribution. And then there's democratic socialism, which blends democracy with socialist economies. Think of Bernie Sanders. At its heart, socialism argues that the economy should serve the people, not the other way around. That means public ownership of industries, stronger union. Blah, 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 blah. At its heart, socialism argues that the economy should serve its people, not the other way around. That means public ownership of industries, stronger unions, free healthcare, free education, and taxes on the wealthy. But socialism, again, has been controversial. Supporters say it creates fairness and justice. Critics say it kills innovation and leads to Critics say it kills innovation, and in its extreme forms is authoritarian. Think of the Cold War. The US and its allies framed socialism and communism as threats to freedoms. Meanwhile, countries like the Soviet Union claimed that they were building equality, but often relied on repression and violence. Today, socialism is making a comeback in new forms. In Latin America, leftist governments like Chile or Bolivia are focusing on wealth distribution. In North America and Europe, younger students are drawn to socialist ideas because they're tired of inequality, student debt, and climate inaction. And the interesting part is many policies we take for granted, like public schools, healthcare, and even minimum wage laws, come from socialist struggles. They weren't gifts from liberalism. They were won by workers demanding change. When someone calls you a socialist today, it might mean you want radical revolution, or it might mean you believe billionaires shouldn't exist while people are homeless. The meaning has shifted, but the fight for equality and fairness is still alive. Conservatism is almost the opposite of socialism, but it is not just one idea either. Conservatism started in the late 18th century as a reaction to the big upheavals like the French Revolution, while revolutionaries were calling for liberty, equality. Conservatives like Edmund Burke said, slow down. Change should be gradual, not radical. At its core, conservatism is about tradition, stability, and order. Conservatives believe that institutions like the family, the church, and the state exist for a reason and we should preserve them. They're skeptical of big social experiments or sudden reforms. But there are two main strands of conservatism, one being traditional and the other being modern. The traditional conservative values hierarchy, authority, religion, and a strong sense of community. The modern conservative focuses more on free markets, small governments, and individual responsibility. Think about leaders like Margaret Thatcher in the UK or Reagan in the US. They pushed for deregulation, tax cuts, and shrinking welfare programs. That's modern conservatism in practice. But conservatism isn't just economics, it's also culture. Many conservatives resist rapid social change, whether it's women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, or radical equality movements. They frame it as protecting tradition or morality. In Canada, conservatism has its own flavor. balancing free markets with nationalism and sometimes populism. And globally, we see conservatism linked to right-wing movements that oppose globalization, immigration, or climate policies. Critics argue that conservatism protects privilege, resists progress, and ignores inequality. Supporters say it provides stability, respects history, and avoids the chaos of sudden change. Here's an example: debates over climate change. A conservative response might be, let's not overhaul the entire economy overnight. Let's adapt slowly, cautiously, and protect industries and jobs. A progressive or socialist response might be, we need to radically change now to save the planet. Conservatism at its heart is about caution. It asks, how much change can society handle before losing its identity? And is holding on to tradition worth the cost of slow progress? So far, we've looked at identities that focus on freedom, equality, or tradition, but politics is also about identity and who belongs to a community and who doesn't. That's where nationalism comes in. Nationalism, at its core, is the belief that people who share a common identity, whether it is language, culture, ethnicity, or history, should form their own nation, and that nation should be sovereign or self-governing. That might sound obvious today. Of course, countries govern themselves, but for most of history, people lived under empires, kingdoms, or colonial powers. The modern nation state is a relatively new idea, and it emerged strongly in the 19th century. Think of the unification of Germany and Italy in the 1800s, or the independence movements against colonial rule in Asia, Africa, and Latin America in the 20th century. Nationalism was the driving force. But again, like all different isms, it's not just one thing, there are different flavors. There is civic nationalism. This is about shared values and citizenship. For example, Canadian or American nationalism often emphasizes democracy, freedom, and multiculturalism. It's about belonging to a political community regardless of your background. Ethnic nationalism is about blood, ancestry, and culture. Think of movements that say only people of a certain ethnic group truly belong. This can be more exclusive and often more dangerous. Then there's anti-colonial nationalism. This is a form that emerged in colonial countries where people fought for independence from imperial powers, India from Britain, Algeria from France, and so on. So nationalism can be liberating. It gave colonized people a sense of dignity and self-determination, but it can also be destructive. Ethnic nationalism fueled wars, genocides, and exclusionary policies. The Holocaust, ethnic cleansing in the Balkans, and today far-right movements in Europe and North America all show the darker sides of nationalism. In our current world, nationalism is back in a big way. You see it in Trump's America First rhetoric. You see it in countries like India, where Hindu nationalism is reshaping policies. And here's the tricky part. Nationalism isn't always right-wing. Leftist movements also use nationalism to resist foreign domination or global capitalism. Think of Indigenous nationalism here in Canada, where First Nations assert sovereignty over their land. That's nationalism too, but it's anti-colonial nationalism. So nationalism is quite complicated. On one hand, it can unite people and build solidarity and fight oppression. On the other hand, it can divide, exclude, and fuel hatred. The big question for us today is, how do we build forms of belonging and community that are inclusive while avoiding the traps of exclusion? That's the challenge nationalism leaves us with. Now let's turn to an ism that reshaped not just politics, but everyday life: feminism. At its core, feminism is the belief that women and men should have equal rights, opportunities, and respect. But like all ideologies, feminism has a history, multiple waves, each with its own focus. The first wave of feminism in the 19th and early 20th centuries was mainly about legal rights. Think about the suffrage, fighting for women's right to vote. These movements were powerful, but often centered middle class white women and did exclude women of color, working class women, and colonized women. The second wave was in the 60s and 70s, and it expanded the agenda. It wasn't just about voting, it was about reproductive rights, workplace equality, and challenging gender roles at home. The slogan was, "The personal is political." Issues like domestic violence, rape, and childcare became central political concerns. The third wave in the 90s and early 2000s pushed back against the idea that there was one universal experience of being a woman. This is where intersectionality, a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, became key. Intersectionality reminds us that gender oppression intersects with race, class, sexuality, and other forms of inequality. Today, some talk about a fourth wave shaped by social media, global movements like #MeToo, and this wave is about calling out sexism, harassment, and structural inequality in real time across borders. Now, again, feminism is not just one thing, there are different branches. Liberal feminism focuses on equal rights and opportunities within the system, breaking glass ceilings, equal pay, legal reform. Radical feminism argues that the system itself is patriarchal and must be fundamentally transformed. Marxist or socialist feminism connects women's oppression to capitalism, pointing out how unpaid domestic labor supports the economy. And decolonial indigenous feminism challenges how colonialism and the patriarchy are intertwined and center the voices of women who are left out of earlier feminist waves. Feminism's impact is huge, from voting rights to workplace protections to conversations about consent and representation. It's changed laws and cultural norms, but feminism has also faced a lot of backlash. Some claim that it's gone too far or that equality has already been achieved. Others distort feminism as being anti-men, which is a complete misunderstanding. Globally, feminism looks different depending on the context. In some places, it's about basic education and protecting from violence. In others, it's about challenging wage gaps or representation in leadership. But its core principle that gender should not limit your life chances remain the same. And feminism is still urgent. Look at the fight for reproduction rights in the US when Roe v. Wade was overturned, or the activism against gender-based violence in other parts of the world. So feminism isn't just history. It's alive, it's evolving, and it's shaping the way we think about justice and equality today. Okay, we've made it to our final ism, environmentalism. And honestly, this one feels a little urgent right now because unlike some ideologies, this isn't just about ideas or identities, it's about survival. At its core, it's a belief that protecting the natural world should be a center part of our politics and our decision making. It challenges the assumption, common in liberalism and capitalism, that humans can endlessly exploit nature for profit without consequences. The roots of environmentalism go a long way back. Indigenous communities across the world have practiced forms of environmental stewardship for centuries, long before it was given a label. But as a political movement, environmentalism really takes shape in the 20th century. In the 60s and 70s, books like Silent Spring exposed the dangers of pesticides and industrial pollution. This sparked modern environmental movements, leading to the first Earth Day in 1970, and eventually to major regulations on clean air, clean water, and endangered species. But environmentalism isn't just about conservation anymore, saving forests, protecting species. It's also about confronting climate change, which is arguably one of the biggest political issues of our time. Now, environmentalism has a few key branches. Conservation, protecting natural resources, often in a more traditional sense, like parks, wildlife, forests. There's deep ecology, a radical idea that nature has a value beyond human use and humans must dramatically change our relationship with the earth. Then there's eco-socialism, connecting environmental destruction to capitalism, arguing that we cannot save the planet without addressing inequality and exploitation. Then there's green politics, focused on bringing environmental concerns to mainstream policy. Think the Green Party in Europe or in Canada. And like the other isms, environmentalism has tensions. Some versions are reformists aiming for green energy, carbon tax, recycling, and sustainable development. Others are revolutionary, saying that the endless economic growth is incompatible with ecological survival. So we see environmental justice movements emphasizing that climate change and pollution don't impact everyone equally. Poor communities, Indigenous peoples, and the global South are hit the hardest, even though they contribute the least to the problem. That's why activists talk about climate justice, not just climate policy. Today, environmentalism shows up in debates about pipelines, wildfires, rising sea levels, and extreme weather. It's a movement like Indigenous land defense struggles here in Canada. It is an international negotiation like the Paris Agreement, and in the protest against governments that fail to meet their promises. So here's the big takeaway. Environmentalism asks us to rethink not just policies, but their values. Instead of treating nature as a backdrop or a resource to extract, it demands that we recognize it as central to human life and justice. So whether you call yourself an environmentalist or not, one thing is clear: politics in the 21st century cannot avoid the environment. It is not an optional issue. It's the context for everything else. That's a wrap on today's episode of Office Hours Politics Edition. Here's the thing. These ideologies are not just abstract theories. They shape the news you read, the policies you live under, and the arguments you hear every day. Understanding them gives you power, the power to think critically, to spot contradictions, and to imagine something better. So whether you find yourself agreeing with one ism or frustrated by them all, the point is to stay engaged, to keep asking questions, and to never stop connecting politics to your own life. Thank you so much for spending all this time with me. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. As always, stay curious and stay politically engaged. Bye, guys.